broke, we were Kuwaitis again. I don't believe that they've seen a happier day in their lives.
Any sense of how they've managed to live through all this period?
Well, I think through organization. Food has been gathered into one location and passed out. I've had a look at some rocket-propelled grenade launchers that I saw months ago back in Kosky that were smuggled in by the resistance and are now here in these locations. They have just tried to pull themselves together, tried to coordinate as best they can, and endure. Nevertheless, about 1,000 of them have been rounded up in just the last week. They have disappeared. I have been shown evidence of torturing. One torture center, I am told by Kuwaitis, was a kindergarten. And on the wall, I saw a bizarre scene, a sign that said something like, "Long live Saddam," right next to a picture of Donald Duck's nephew. It is a surreal place right now, Peter.
Just to remind people at home why you look like you do, it's the middle of the night in Kuwait City, and we're photographing you with a night scope. As you've driven around the city, how much evidence have you seen of really serious physical damage?
Considerable. All of the streets are littered with burned-out tanks or tanks that have simply been deserted, cars that have been torched and looted. We drove by stores. Each and every one of them was burned out. The police station that I visited had been burned by the Iraqis just before they left, and all along on the horizon, you can see those oil fires about which we have heard so much. And as we have gotten so much closer to them now, you can see that they are absolutely huge. So what we have here is a deserted and empty city with these glowing red embers on the horizon.
I think people may be a little puzzled as to how it is that you are ahead of advancing U.S. forces. How did that work out?
Well, in fact, I am here by the graces of the Saudi government. Prince General Khalid bin Sultan, who is the leader of the Allied forces, has invited me to work with the Saudi forces. That's why I was in Kuwait on the far southeastern side and why I've been able to pass through some checkpoints here. We are operating entirely on our own and without a military census.
I was really concerned about your safety, actually. So you're really there with Saudi forces in the city. You're not hanging out there alone, just you and no other forces.
Well, then let me be clear. No, I'm saying that's how I got past the checkpoints here.
No.
We are, in fact, right here by ourselves, although I count the Kuwaiti resistance to be good company.
Okay. How many members of the Kuwaiti resistance have you come across? Do they look like a significant force, or are they a small number of people you've run into?
I'm not really able to tell you that. One Kuwaiti resistance leader says there are about 3,000 of them. I have only seen 10 or 15 people, a group that was at the police station, a few people that we have come across here. I think that they are scattered through the city, and I suspect that they are not a particularly large number, although by tomorrow I'll be able to give you a better read on that.
ABC's Forrest Sawyer in Kuwait City, who we talked to just a short while ago. He looks that color because we shot it with the night scope. It is, of course, the middle of the night there. If much of the battle to retake Kuwait seems to have been easier than commanders had expected, that is by no means universally true. ABC's Bob Zelnick reports tonight on a major tank battle that is still being fought on the outskirts of Kuwait City.
Marines advancing toward the international airport south of Kuwait City have met sustained resistance from elements of Iraq's heavily armored Third Corps. Control of that area is vital to the Allies because it is a major intersection for roads heading north. By nightfall, the battle was still undecided.
It had gotten dark and both sides broke off, and I would tell you that the U.S. forces in that area are getting pretty tired right now. They've been attacking constantly for 3 days.
Earlier, in a significant encounter, Marines defeated brigades from the same Iraqi Corps. After learning that Iraqi T-55 tanks were massing for a counterattack along the route north, the Marines attacked with artillery and airstrikes. Military sources say that caused the Iraqis to surge forward toward Marine positions. Marines using older M60 tanks destroyed nearly 80 of the Iraqi tanks along with rocket launchers and other combat vehicles. The Marines did not lose a single tank. To the north, Allied forces have blocked the Republican Guards from retreating further into Iraq. Units from the Allied 7th Corps engaged the Republican Guards, inflicting serious damage on one mechanized division and lesser damage on 2 armored divisions. Throughout the theater, the Iraqis have had trouble retreating. Military sources say that is because of the heavy Allied bombing, which has made communications between the Iraqi units extremely difficult.
The battlefield is confused right now on the part of the Iraqis. They're having difficulty sensing from which direction they might be attacked.
Senior Pentagon officials predict the full liberation of Kuwait City tomorrow. They say the ground war planned for 7 to 10 days will be over inside of a week. Bob Zelnick, ABC News at the Pentagon.
In a moment, the confusion and anger in the streets of the Jordanian capital, Amman. How will the war end for Saddam Hussein and making plans to rebuild Kuwait? World. Many people who had supported or counted on Saddam Hussein find it hard to believe that he is folding so easily. ABC's John Donovan is in the Jordanian capital, Amman.
Everywhere in Amman today, people asked, can it be true? Their newspapers have favored Iraq's version of events in the war. Their television has not broadcast pictures of Iraqi troops surrendering. Most people had no idea that Iraq was anywhere near losing Kuwait until Saddam Hussein told them himself.
We really feel very, very depressed. 99% of the Jordanian people are really depressed about this thing.
A rare admission to a foreign TV camera today. Many people here are fed up with the questions of Western journalists. Everyone else insists that Iraq has done well, that Saddam Hussein is leaving Kuwait to fight another day.
No, we are not defeated. At the right time, he took this step in order to save his forces.
Palestinian leaders argue that the crisis at least drew attention to their cause.
And we are very much satisfied with the fact that the Palestinian case is on the top of the agenda these days.
Another pro-Baghdad demonstration here tonight outside the Iraqi embassy, but it was brief and small, in part because Jordanian police closed the area. In part also perhaps because people here are more confused than they want to let on. When cameras are not around, some here say that while they wanted the bloodshed stopped, they did not want Iraq to quit so soon, and that while Saddam Hussein fought like a hero, he may also have set back the Palestinian cause. John Donovan, ABC News, Amman.
Much the same sentiments were being expressed by many of the 1.5 million Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. A far cry today from the reaction in most of Israel. Here's ABC's Dean Reynolds.
The words of Saddam Hussein hung heavily over the West Bank today. The Asawi family took their tea and coffee with lumps of chagrin, their faces the picture of disappointment, despite their words of defiance. We supported Saddam, Majis Asawi says, because he supported us. It is a human reaction. But the news is bad. Saddam Hussein is losing this war, and so too, in a way, are they.
There are many who are disappointed, who are sad, who feel that the West seriously wants to humiliate Saddam and want to see, and through him to humiliate the Arabs.
That idea also troubles the Israeli military. A humiliated Saddam Hussein may mean more missile attacks on Israel.
He's going to use this measure, or these missiles, in order to improve his bargaining position up to the last moment.
But the sense among most Israelis is that the danger is almost gone. This week is Purim in Israel, the Jewish equivalent of Halloween. School children made light of the war with their costumes, a Patriot missile, a U.S. soldier, a gas mask kit. For these Tel Aviv children, what once was strange is now familiar. Dean Reynolds, ABC News, Tel Aviv.
We'll have more news in just a moment. Hussein has lost the military battle. The argument intensifies over the eventual political outcome of the war. The administration has made no secret of the fact that it would be very happy to see Saddam Hussein deposed. Here's ABC's John McCracken.
Polls show a vast majority of Americans think the final objective of the U.S. war effort should be to force Saddam Hussein from power. Increasingly, that sentiment is shared by members of Congress.
Saddam Hussein may call himself a victor, but he should be treated as the loser he is, and the terms of surrender should exclude him from being the leader of Iraq.
This international blowhard must now face the music. In the words of the 1960 hit by the Guess Who, Saddam, it's too late. You've gone too far. You've lost this one. You've come undone.
Many in the Bush administration share these views, but officials say because the UN mandate does not call for Saddam Hussein's removal and U.S. laws prohibit assassinations, President Bush is now resigned to the fact that the United States will probably have to tolerate Saddam Hussein for a while longer. Officials say their best hope now is that the Iraqi people will do the job once they contemplate what their leader has done. His big ideas have all failed. Instead of adding a rich new province to bankroll Iraq's rush toward new prosperity, Saddam Hussein has drawn the wrath of the world upon his country. His military was once the largest in the Middle East and a source of great pride to the Iraqi people. It is now a shambles. His economy is a disaster, and with him in charge, it will probably stay that way. No one who has the money wants to help rebuild Iraq with Saddam Hussein in power. It is the hope of the Bush administration that what is left of the Iraqi military will realize that its leader is a loser and find some way to replace him. John McWethy, ABC News, the State Department.
As governments begin to devote more time to thinking about how this war will end and how the fractures in the Middle East are set and perhaps even mended, politicians and diplomats will inevitably look to the past for examples. There is no one example. But by way of illustration, if not example, this is how the Great War, World War I, ended. By the summer of 1918, after 4 bloody years of war, the German army was losing its will to fight. The Battle of the Marne in France was decisive. 15,000 German soldiers were captured on August the 8th, 1918, as they tried to retreat in panic. It was the beginning of the end of World War I. The fighting continued for more than 2 months. By the end of October, German supply lines in France and Belgium were virtually cut off. On October 29th, sailors of the German fleet in the North Atlantic mutinied. The sailors had had enough, and so had the German people. "Sir, you no longer have an army," an aide told the German leader, Kaiser Wilhelm. On November the 9th, the German government fell. Kaiser Wilhelm fled to the Netherlands the next day. On November the 11th, in a railway car just north of Paris, Germany agreed to the Allied terms of armistice, a temporary truce. German troops would leave all occupied territory. Their weapons would be left in place. In January 1919, the Allies met at the Versailles Palace outside Paris to write a formal peace treaty. They agreed that Germany should be punished and prevented from ever making war again. An economic blockade was imposed on Germany. Germany would pay Allied governments reparations for the loss of civilians and property. The German army would be limited to 100,000 men. Germany would not be allowed to rebuild its air force or navy. Parts of Germany would be occupied by Allied security forces for 15 years. On June the 28th, suffering intense hardship from the blockade, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. After 5 years and the deaths of nearly 15 million soldiers and civilians, the Great War was formally over. Despite the provisions of the peace, some say because the terms were so harsh, it would take Germany less than 20 years to rearm and go to war again. Not a complete parallel, obviously, but some similarities. The lingering effects of another war. North Korea has placed its army on combat alert because of what it calls provocation moves of the United States and its South Korean puppets. Every year about this time, the U.S. and South Korea hold joint military exercises. Every year, the North Koreans, who are still technically at war with the South, go on alert to show their disapproval. We'll be back in a moment. Environmental officials say there was so much damage to the oil facilities in Kuwait, they have no idea where the latest slick is coming from, but it appears to be the biggest one yet. And the Pentagon showed pictures today of what all those oil fires mean. Here's a reconnaissance photograph showing relatively clear skies over Kuwait City last Friday. Now look at this. The city nearly obscured by smoke the next day. The wind shifted, and more oil wells had been sabotaged. Well, the burning oil wells have simply intensified the debate over who is going to pay for war damage. UN Resolution 674 reminds Iraq that it is liable for any loss, any damage or injury in Kuwait. One thing is clear, the job of rebuilding will be enormously expensive, and a lot of American companies are hoping to get a share. Here's ABC's Bob Jamieson.
Inside the headquarters of America's biggest construction and engineering firms, planning for Kuwait's reconstruction has been going on for months. Executives at firms like Bechtel refuse to talk about those plans. They do not want to be seen profiting from a war in which Americans are dying, but profit they will. Kuwait's government in exile says it could cost $40 billion to
to restore not only the country's basic infrastructure, but its sophisticated technology and those things which made for a comfortable lifestyle.
The Iraqis came to occupy the country with a determined policy of dismantling it totally, systematically, looting it.
Of particular concern are the fires burning in Kuwait's oil fields. Officials do not know how long it will take or how much it will cost to put them out. But reconstruction plans are based on the belief they will have to rebuild the entire industry.
Are you operating under a belief that you will confront the worst case?
Yes, we are.
Kuwaiti economist Fawzi al-Sultan established a reconstruction task force in August. From the third floor of this building, around the corner from the White House, Kuwaiti officials will sign nearly 200 contracts for reconstruction during just the first 3 months after the war. The Army Corps of Engineers will get $46 million to oversee restoration of basic services like water and sewers. AT&T and Motorola will provide emergency communications. Caterpillar has sold diesel generators that will provide electricity. General Motors will sell vehicles. And oil field equipment has been purchased and is stored in this Houston warehouse. The reconstruction will not be exclusively the business of the United States and the other countries which are doing the fighting. Kuwaitis say business will also go to firms from Germany and Japan.
There's a very strong commitment that we will try and deal as much as we can where we can find the equipment with our coalition partners.
But one thing is certain. Once the war ends, American politicians will be lobbying hard to make sure very little business goes elsewhere. Bob Jameson, ABC News, New York.
There is other news today here. How meager were people's lives, do they tell you?
Well, the people that I saw seemed not to have suffered too much in terms of food and water. I was struck by the people who were very keen to show me some of the wounds that they had suffered that had been inflicted by Iraqis. One man showed me his arm, and there was a mark that had been burnt in. He said that they were trying to write Saddam's name into his arm. Others showed me where their fingernails had been pulled out. And all of them talked about friends that they had lost throughout the occupation.
Does everybody have a story about the occupation?
Everyone that I've talked to so far has a story, and none of the stories are very happy. I think that the happiness begins at about this point, Peter.
When you showed up today, some hours ago, were people surprised to see you?
They surely were. As a matter of fact, we drove in through this dark road. It was just a group of us, and we had passed the last Saudi checkpoint a number of kilometers back, and we kept pushing forward and forward and forward, and then arrived in the dead center of town, not at all sure what we were going to find. A little light was up in an apartment building, and then we began to talk to them, and as soon as they heard that we were speaking English with an American accent, they began leaping up and down and saying that at last the things that they had been waiting for 7 months had finally arrived. We went upstairs. Each of them in this deserted building had their little apartment, 6 families in all. All of them wanted to show us their apartment. All of them wanted us to sit down and share some tea and hear what the outside world was like.
Okay, Forrest, thank you very much for a very long day for you. Look forward to hearing from you tomorrow when we can see what Kuwait City looks like extensively in daylight. There will, of course, be more, including Forrest Sawyer. Later this evening on Nightline, we'll have a Gulf War update every hour on the hour, but it has been another very effective day for the Allied forces, and Kuwait City has been liberated. The Iraqis have, when they could, run. That's our report on World News Tonight.
In New York, the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations stated his country's terms. He also took the opportunity to get in a few swipes at the Allies.
I have requested a meeting to convey to him the new decision by the Iraqi government on the highest level to abide by all the resolutions of the Security Council, which are yet to be implemented. Of course, some of them have already been implemented, and we have completed our withdrawal from Kuwait. The last soldier actually left Kuwait dawn today, local time, although the American and other forces kept attacking our forces. As far as the other resolution, we are ready if the Security Council would announce a ceasefire resolution.
There may have been some miscommunication between New York and Baghdad. The ambassador seemed to be suggesting that Iraq would abide by all of the UN resolutions, but Baghdad radio mentioned only 3, and that's not good enough for the White House. Spokesperson Marlin Fitzwater says Iraq has to accept all UN resolutions, including the one that continues the economic embargo. Well, the war may not be over, but in Kuwait City, people are enjoying their first taste of freedom in some 7 months. Sniper fire still rings out, and people are warned about unexploded mines and booby traps. But everywhere there are signs of relief and the desire to move ahead. Bob McEwen describes the scene there this morning.
The Allies entered Kuwait City this morning, U.S. Marines and members of the Pan-Arab forces driving into Kuwait's capital and into its heart. In certain parts of the city, some fighting still goes on, but these were shots fired not in anger, but in joy. The Iraqi occupation has taken an obvious toll, however. The city is scarred, in places still in flames, after Iraq's sudden withdrawal on Monday night. And everywhere there are witnesses to the carnage that has dominated life in Kuwait since Saddam Hussein decided this country should be his.
The whole thing is violence for the sake of violence, destruction for the sake of destruction, and killing for the sake of killing. If you go around Kuwait now, I mean, the country has been literally sodomized.
Every night they had some tanks inside Kuwait City, and they will set buildings on flame and burn them, and then we'll bring the tanks and shoot the buildings. An example of that is Sheraton Hotel, as you can see. They put some flammable liquids into it, burnt it, and then struck it with tank artillery.
As street fighting continued not far from the U.S. Embassy, Iraqi POWs left behind by the midnight retreat hoped that they would find more compassion from the Kuwaitis than the Kuwaitis did from them. But today in Kuwait City, for the first time since August the 2nd, the people of Kuwait can think more about the present than the past. Bob McEwen, CBS News, in Kuwait City.
It's one of the unavoidable aspects of war, and the term used to describe it seems to leave everybody a bit uncomfortable. Death by friendly fire. The latest victims, a group of British soldiers. Colonel Barry Stevens explained what happened at this morning's briefing.
There was an incident yesterday in which an American A-10 inadvertently fired on two of our infantry fighting vehicles. The aircraft was one of several which had been called into deal with an enemy position, and the incident itself is, of course, under investigation. The incident accounted for 9 of our dead. You will understand that that is a matter of particular sadness, both to ourselves and to the American forces.
It's likely there will be more British and American casualties as Allied troops drive into Iraq. Forces are now engaged in what may be the toughest battle of the war. Some 700 American tanks and armored vehicles are facing off against close to 300 tanks of the Republican Guards near Basra. Reports are that the elite Iraqi units are putting up a tough fight, but a U.S. command official says, quote, "We've got them where we want them," end of quote. Well, the war is not over, but it sure looked as if it was at a press briefing a while ago by the Allied commander. General Norman Schwarzkopf revealed many specific details about how the war was started and where military units had been placed. The general shared his thoughts on one reason why the Allied forces may have been so successful. He thinks it has something to do with the quality of the enemy.
As far as Saddam Hussein being a great military strategist, he is neither a strategist, nor is he schooled in the operational arts, nor is he a tactician, nor is he a general, nor is he as a soldier. Other than that, he's a great military man. I want you to know that.
Here are details from the Gulf War. The Iraqis are working fast to arrange a ceasefire, but the ground war is moving faster. Here's a quick look at what's happening on both fronts. A huge battle is developing west of Basra. 800 Allied tanks and armored vehicles are bearing down on the Republican Guard. Iraq has accepted key resolutions from the UN, nullifying the annexation of Kuwait and opening the door for war reparations. But Iraq still refused to accept the UN trade embargo, and the U.S. says that means the fighting goes on. The celebration has already started in Kuwait City. Cheers for the Arab coalition troops and the U.S. Marines rolling into the devastated city. The people say the retreating Iraqis looted almost anything they could move and torched what they couldn't. There's still gunfire in the city, most of it from exhilarated Kuwaitis. The only joy for the captured Iraqis is that they're out of the fight. Some of them have been living on grass and rainwater for 4 weeks. There's no count on the total. Estimates range upwards from 50,000. Pictures like these led President Bush to say today that the war is almost over. And Americans have paid the price of victory. 56 soldiers have died in the fighting, 28 of them in a Scud attack on a barracks in Saudi Arabia. Among them, 2 women, members of a reserve unit from Newcastle, Pennsylvania. 22-year-old Christine Mays and 23-year-old Beverly Clark are the first women killed in the battle. The governor of Pennsylvania has declared a week of mourning. And coming up tonight at 5 o'clock, Dr. Nancy Snyderman will have an in-depth look at a health threat that will strike 1 in 10 women, breast cancer, how to find it, and what are your...
Again, today we had a very significant day when the Arab forces coming from both the west and the east closed in and moved into Kuwait City, where they are now in the process of clearing Kuwait City entirely and assuring that it's absolutely secure. The 1st Marine Division continues to hold Kuwaiti International Airport. The 2nd Marine Division continues to be in a position where it blocks any egress out of the city of Kuwait so no one can leave. To date, we have destroyed over 29, destroyed or rendered inoperable. I don't like to say destroyed because that gives you the visions of absolutely killing everyone, and that's not what we're doing. But we have rendered completely ineffective over 29 Iraqi divisions, and the gates are closed. There is no way out of here. There is no way out of here, and the enemy is fighting us in this location right here. We continue, of course, to have overwhelming air power. The air has done a terrific job from start to finish in supporting the ground forces, and we also have had great support from the Navy, both in the form of naval gunfire and in the support of carrier air. That's the situation at the present time.
The chart you showed there with the attrition rates of the various forces was almost the exact reverse of what most of us thought was happening. It showed the frontline troops attrited to 75% or more, and the Republican Guards, which a lot of public focus was on when we were covering the air war, attrited at less than 75. Why is that? I mean, how did it come to pass?
What happened is the air campaign shifted from the strategic phase into the theater, and we knew all along that this was the important area. The nightmare scenario for all of us would have been to go through, get hung up in this breach right here, and then have the enemy artillery rain chemical weapons down on troops that were in a gaggle in the breach right there. That was the nightmare scenario. So one of the things that we felt we must have established is an absolute as much destruction as we could possibly get of the artillery, the direct support artillery that would be firing on that wire. That's why we shifted it in the very latter days. We absolutely punished this area very heavily because that was the first challenge. Once we got through this and we're moving, then it's a different war. Then we're fighting our kind of war. Before we get through that, we're fighting their kind of war, and that's what we didn't want to have to do.
I wonder if in an overview, despite these enormously illustrative pictures, you could say what's left of the Iraqi army in terms of how long could it be before he could ever be a regional threat or a threat to the region again?
Well, there's not enough left at all for him to be a regional threat to the region, an offensive regional threat. As you know, he's got a very large army, but most of the army that is left north of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley is an infantry army. It's not an armored army. It's not an armor-heavy army, which means it really isn't an offensive army. So it doesn't have enough left unless someone chooses to rearm them in the future.
You said you've got all these divisions along the border which were seriously attrited. It figures to be about 200,000 troops, maybe, that were there. You've got 50,000 prisoners. Where's the rest of them?
There was a very, very large number of dead in these units, a very, very large number of dead. We even found them when we went into the units ourselves and found them in the trench lines. There were very heavy desertions. At one point, we had reports of desertion rates of more than 30% of the units that were along the front here. As you know, we had quite a large number of POWs that came across, and so I think it's a combination of desertions. There's a combination of people that were killed. There's a combination of the people that we've captured, and there's a combination of some other people who are just flat still running. Yes, sir.
What kind of fight is going on with the Republican Guard? And is there any more fighting going on in Kuwait, or is Kuwait essentially out of the action?
No. The type of fight that's going on with the Republican Guard right now is just a classic tank battle. You've got fire and maneuver. You've got, they are continuing to fight and shoot at us as our forces move forward, and our forces are in the business of outflanking them, taking them from the rear, using our attack helicopters, using our advanced technology. I would tell you that one of the things that has prevailed, particularly in this battle out here, is our technology. We had great weather for the air war, but right now and for the last 3 days, it's been raining out there, it's been dusty out there, there's black smoke and haze in the air. It's an infantryman's weather. God loves the infantryman, and that's just the kind of weather the infantryman likes to fight in. But I would also tell you that our sights have worked fantastically well in their ability to acquire, through that kind of dust and haze, the enemy targets.
Did you think that this would turn out? I realize a great deal of strategy and planning went into it, but when it took place, did you think this would turn out to be such an easy cakewalk as it seems? And secondly, what are your impressions of Saddam Hussein as a military strategist?
As I told you all for a very, very long time, it is very, very important for a military commander never to assume away the capabilities of his enemy. And when you're facing an enemy that is over 500,000 strong, has the reputation that they've had of fighting for 8 years, being combat-hardened veterans, had the number of tanks and the type of equipment they had, you don't assume away anything. So we certainly did not expect it to go this way. As far as Saddam Hussein being a great military strategist, he is neither a strategist, nor is he schooled in the operational arts, nor is he a tactician, nor is he a general, nor is he as a soldier. Other than that, he's a great military man. I want you to know that.
General, I'm wondering how much resistance there still is in Kuwait. And I'm wondering what you would say to people who would say the purpose of this war was to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and they're now out. What would you say to that public that is thinking that right now?
I would say that there was a lot more purpose of this war than just get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. The purpose of this war was to enforce the resolutions of the United Nations. There's some 12 different resolutions of the United Nations, not all of which have been accepted by Iraq to date, as I understand it. Okay? But I got to tell you that in the business of the military, of a military commander, my job is not to go ahead and at some point say, well, that's great, they've just now pulled out of Kuwait. Even though they're still shooting at us, they're moving backwards, and therefore I've accomplished my mission. That's not the way you fight it, and that's not the way I would ever fight it. Back in the back, please.
General, are you still bombing in northern Iraq? And if you are, what's the purpose of it now?
Yes. I'm sorry.
What's being achieved now?
Military purposes is exactly the same things we were trying to achieve before. Okay, the war is not over, and you've got to remember people are still dying out there, okay? And those people that are dying are my troops, and I'm going to continue to protect those troops in every way I possibly can until the war is over. Yes, sir, right here.
In the United Nations General Assembly is talking about peace, and as a military man, do you look at your challenge and you're going to get some satisfaction out of having achieved it? Is there some fear on your part that there will be a ceasefire that will keep you from fulfilling the assignment that you have? Is your assignment as a military man, separate from the political goals of the...
Do I fear a ceasefire?
Do you fear that you will not be able to accomplish your ends, that there will be some political pressure brought on the campaign?
I think I've made it very clear to everybody that I just assumed the war had never started, and I just assumed never have lost a single life out there. That was not our choice. We've accomplished our mission, and when the decision makers come to the decision that there should be a ceasefire, nobody will be happier than me.
General Schwarzkopf said 79 Americans have been killed in the war so far, including 28 in the ground campaign. He described the relatively low casualty rate as miraculous. He said 213 have been wounded. The Army today identified 11 of the 28 U.S. military personnel who died in Monday's Scud attack on a barracks building in Saudi Arabia. The list included the first 2 U.S. women to die in the war. A British military spokesman said 9 British soldiers were killed yesterday when a U.S. Air Force A-10 jet mistakenly opened fire on their armored vehicle. It was the first incident of so-called friendly fire since the ground war began. At his briefing today, General Schwarzkopf said the Allies have destroyed or captured more than 3,700 of Iraq's 4,280 tanks. Also destroyed were 1,856 armored vehicles and 2,140 artillery pieces. He said more than 50,000 Iraqi prisoners had been taken, and that number was growing.
The rout of Iraqi forces in Kuwait brought angry protests in parts of the Arab world. In Amman, Jordan, Palestinian women marched on the American embassy, chanting anti-American slogans. In Cairo, several hundred pro-Iraqi Egyptian students clashed with riot police. It was the 4th consecutive day of riots in the Egyptian capital. And in Lebanon, 6,000 Palestinians in a refugee camp staged a 2-hour demonstration. They waved Iraqi flags and called on Saddam Hussein to use chemical weapons against Allied troops.
The White House has announced that President Bush will address the nation about the war at 9 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. Earlier in the day, there were mixed signals from Iraq on its offer to accept the United Nations resolutions on Kuwait. The Security Council met in closed consultations late today to try to clarify the terms of that offer. At the meeting, they called on Iraq to abide by all 12 resolutions. On Baghdad radio, Iraq said it would accept only the resolutions requiring it to recognize Kuwait, pay war reparations, and immediately release all POWs. But at the UN, Iraq's ambassador said Iraq would accept all resolutions that remain relevant.
Well, I informed the President of the Council of Iraq's decision to accept and implement all the resolutions of the Security Council. As far as Iraq is concerned, of course, some of the resolutions are no longer applicable or relevant, such as those related to foreigners or embassies and other things.
Just how well can we understand the mind?
Very soon, we hope that they will issue a resolution calling for a ceasefire and an end to all hostilities so that to expedite and accelerate the implementation of the resolution.
Britain's Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd said it wasn't clear whether the Iraqi ambassador's comments accurately reflected the Iraqi position. Hurd spoke at the White House after a meeting with President Bush.
I've seen two texts from Iraq this morning. One is the statement which the Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz relayed through the Soviet Union. And that is clearly not adequate because it does not accept fully all the UN resolutions on the subject. It picks and chooses again. Secondly, I've seen the transcript of a broadcast by the Iraqi ambassador, i.e. a less authentic document, which purports to go further and accept everything. So we've had these two different documents, both claiming to be official Iraqi documents, out of New York already today, and those have to be assessed. And that assessment is going on now, and we'll be talking about it again later this afternoon.
Saddam Hussein himself. You need to hear from Saddam Hussein himself.
Clearly, any Iraqi statement has to be with his authority. It must be clearly with his authority, and it must clearly accept all the Security Council resolutions.
With defeat on the battlefield, sir, with defeat on the battlefield, is it not conceivable that Saddam Hussein will never say the right words and that Allied forces will face the possibility of just remaining there and continuing to bomb?
No, I don't think that's very likely. I don't think that's the way things are going to turn out. But we have to assess what the Iraqis have said and written in the course of today and respond accordingly. Everybody wants this fighting to come to an end, but it has to come to an end when the Iraqis have clearly both in what they say at the UN and on the battlefield when they have shown that they are complying with what the world community has asked for.
Mr. Al-Anbari seems to be suggesting that any acceptance of 12 resolutions would follow a declaration of a ceasefire. Is that the wrong way around?
Well, let's continue assessing what they have actually said, what the two documents mean, which is the superior one, and what we can actually derive from it. There's no desire, it's quite clear there's no desire here, there's no desire in London to continue fighting longer than is necessary to secure the aims for which we entered the fight. But that we are going to do. We're going to make this a solid success.
Well, Mr. Minister, how do the economic sanctions remaining on? Do you expect those to stay on after the fighting stops?
I would expect the sanctions to continue after the fighting had stopped. Yes, I would. Because that will depend on the policies of whatever government there is in Iraq. But I think clearly some of the UN aims, for example, the payment of compensation, that is not going to be achieved through a ceasefire. There are going to be further discussions, there are a whole number of detainees, for example. People whom the Iraqis detain. There are going to be a whole lot of matters which need to be settled after the ceasefire. And during that, I think, during that time, clearly sanctions will need to remain. That will be a matter for the Security Council to assess and decide.
Mr. Minister, how do you see this actually ending on the battlefield? You've said that you don't expect it to turn out to be a situation in which Saddam never says the right words. How do you foresee this actually ending?
Well, I expect there will come a time when the military objectives of the Allied forces have been achieved. But we're not at that point today.
Later, Hurd met with Secretary of State Baker at the State Department. During a photo session before that meeting, Baker spoke about maintaining sanctions on Iraq after the war.
Only the Security Council can eliminate sanctions that they voted, but you know what our position is, and that is that as long as that particular government continues in power, we will want to make certain, at least with respect to arms, that there's some sort of constraints upon rearmament and the shipment of arms into that country, and particularly weapons of mass destruction.
Now, 4 opinions about the question of when and how this war should end. It comes from 2 in Congress, Senator Albert Gore, Democrat of Tennessee, and Congresswoman...
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tonight, America at war. Reporting from Kuwait City, Tom Brokaw with Jane Pauley in Washington.
Good evening from the heart of Kuwait City, which still is without power tonight, even though it has been liberated now after 7 months of Iraqi occupation. And there are very dramatic developments tonight that indicate this war finally is coming rapidly to a close. It has been announced at the White House in just the past few moments that President Bush will address the nation tonight at 9 o'clock. And at the Defense Department now, NBC's Fred Francis, who has been speaking with senior Pentagon officials. Fred, what's the latest word?
Tom, the senior officials say the war is winding down. The senior official characterized the fighting as mostly over, and they're calling it here at the Pentagon the 4-day war. We can tell you that the senior official said that the bombing, American and Allied bombing of Baghdad and Iraq has slowed way down. And today there was a major battle on the road outside of Basra called Highway 8. The U.S. won that battle. It could be, according to this official, the last and only big battle of this war. Saddam Hussein, who started the war with 4,200 tanks, has far fewer than that tonight, probably less than 500. And his Republican Guard is in its death throes. And today, General Norman Schwarzkopf revealed that finishing the Republican Guards in Iraq was as much a mission as liberating Kuwait.
If I'm to accomplish the mission that I was given, and that's to make sure that the Republican Guard is rendered incapable of conducting the type of heinous act that they've conducted so often in the past, what has to be done is these forces continue to attack across here and put the Republican Guard out of business.
In an extraordinary briefing that gave the world, including Saddam, the first look at how the Iraqi army had been routed, Schwarzkopf crowed about U.S. forces like the 101st Airborne landing deep in Iraq and how he could have taken Baghdad.
Ladies and gentlemen, when we were here, we were 150 miles away from Baghdad, and there was nobody between us and Baghdad. If it had been our intention to take Iraq, if it had been our intention to destroy the country, if it had been our intention to overrun the country, we could have done it unopposed for all intents and purposes from this position at that time.
The victory is almost complete. One senior Pentagon source predicted the fighting could end tomorrow. Officials said the American losses are remarkably light. At day's end, 23 Americans had died in the air war, 28 in ground combat, 28 from a Scud missile attack, including 2 women, for a total of 79 dead, and 53 missing or captured. And the fighting continues. 2 American divisions have trapped 2 Republican Guard units near Basra, Iraq. And an Allied force of 80,000 is closing in on the last 3 Guard units, which are also trying to flee.
Where we are today is we now have a solid wall across the north of the 18th Airborne Corps, consisting of the units shown right here, attacking straight to the east. We have a solid wall here again of the 7th Corps, also attacking straight to the east. The forces that they are fighting right now are the forces of the Republican Guard.
One Pentagon officer said the oily fires set by Iraqis had backfired on them. Thermal gun sights on U.S. tanks worked flawlessly, but the hazy, oily skies blinded the Iraqi tank crews.
We've had several anecdotal reports today of enemy who were saying to us that they couldn't see anything through their sights, and all of a sudden their tank exploded when their tank was hit by our sight.
In that 2-day running tank battle, military leaders report that while most of Iraq's tanks have been put out of action, not one American tank has been destroyed. And for the first time today, General Schwarzkopf reported that thousands of Iraqis had deserted, and many had been killed. Classified estimates put the losses at 80,000.
There was a very, very large number of dead in these units, a very, very large number of dead. We even found them when we went into the units ourselves and found them in the trench lines. There were very heavy desertions. At one point, we had reports of desertion rates of more than 30% of the units that were along the front here.
Well, Tom, for all intents and purposes, this war is over. In the last 4 hours, most of the information in that report has changed so dramatically. The senior Pentagon official said there is only one Iraqi division left. That is the Hammurabi division, and it is running for Iran. And in daylight hours, there will be clear skies, and it may not make it. Tom?
That will be even more welcome news here in Kuwait, of course, and we want to go to the White House now, where NBC's John Cochran is standing by with more news on that late development tonight that the president is prepared to talk to the nation at what, John, 9 p.m. tonight Eastern Time?
That's right, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. The White House officials will say, even privately, all they'll say is that the president will announce a course of action. We don't know what that is. We are told he will not appeal to Saddam Hussein to stop the fighting. Today, Saddam tried to get a ceasefire through the United Nations. It didn't work. With complete victory so near, President Bush showed little interest in Saddam's call for a ceasefire. The president said that so far, U.S. forces have done everything he could have hoped for, and more.
The news continues to be very, very good, very, very heartening. I know that all Americans took great joy in the beginning of the liberation of Kuwait City, but the liberation of Kuwait, the country, is almost complete.
Bush said visitors to the White House today caught him on an upbeat day, a bit of understatement, the kind usually associated with the British, like Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd.
I understand.
Bush and Hurd agreed that Saddam's latest attempt to get a ceasefire won't work. At the UN, the Iraqi ambassador said his country was now willing to accept all 12 UN resolutions on the Gulf crisis. But a letter from the Iraqi foreign minister, Tariq Aziz, indicated Iraq was imposing its own conditions.
The Iraqis are still conditioning their acceptance of the resolutions on lifting the economic embargo. If that's the case, obviously, it isn't what we've been looking for.
Secretary of State Baker said economic sanctions against Saddam might continue after the war, and the arms embargo will definitely continue.
We will want to make certain, at least with respect to arms, that there's some sort of constraints upon rearmament and the shipment of arms into that country, and particularly weapons of mass destruction.
And tonight, when President Bush goes on national television, we believe he will talk about the post-war era and specifically about a post-war Iraq. I am told that the president will not, however, announce a ceasefire. Tonight, the UN Security Council has called on Iraq to accept all 12 UN resolutions concerning the Gulf crisis. U.S. officials say that even if Saddam agrees, he's already finished as a military power. Tom?
Thanks, John. And tragically, the people of Kuwait City probably can't hear that news tonight because this town has been so devastated by 7 months of Iraqi rule. But then today, during the daylight hours, the people of Kuwait City were out cheering everyone. The Americans, the Egyptians, the Saudis, they even cheered a convoy of journalists as we drove into town. NBC's Brad Willis tonight on a long night and a day in the Kuwaiti capital.
It was a day of triumph for the Kuwaiti people and their American allies as U.S. Marines rolled into Kuwait City. Kuwaitis of all ages and walks of life applauded and embraced these fighting men, blessing them for the liberation of their nation.
And I have only one message to say. God bless your heart, America. Really, I would like to shake every American hand what they are coming to help and to let our country free.
In the streets, they danced and chanted, "George Bush, George Bush," a refrain in honor of a Western leader that before this war would have been unthinkable in the Islamic world. But on the outskirts of Kuwait City today, sporadic clashes with small groups of Iraqis continued. On the highways, more of Saddam Hussein's men lay dead from overnight fighting.
He's wounded!
In the morning light, those who survived sought to surrender. Many here in this war-torn city bitterly recalled what the Iraqis wrought upon their nation.
They killed one of my friends. She was a girl. They took her, and after a month, they killed her, and they brought her to her house, and they just shot her there. She was dead, but they had to just, shoot her in front of everybody around the house.
But despite the war, the brutality, the devastation of their city, the people of Kuwait today celebrated something far more important, their freedom, and they also celebrated the Americans who helped them win it. Brad Willis, NBC News, Kuwait City.
And tonight, as it looks the entire war may be over, we'll return in a moment with Jane Pauley, talks with Tom Aspel in Baghdad.
Threats and defiance gave way to fear and confusion. 13 days of escalating concessions have been too little, too late to stave off a humiliating defeat. Earlier today, I spoke with NBC's Tom Aspel in Baghdad, whose report was cleared by Iraqi military censors.
Jane, the Iraqis think they've done enough. They've pulled their troops back from Kuwait, but they can't understand why there's still no ceasefire. Baghdad didn't have to wait for news to filter back from the West that their newest concessions weren't enough. The Allied response came direct from above, and it came down hard. No more high-tech missiles are needed to hit this city now. Tonight's raid was from low-flying airplanes, weaving through the ground fire, bombing a confused and crippled capital. Air power. It put out Baghdad's lights right at the beginning of the war, and the city hasn't worked since. The main electricity plant and 10 other substations are in ruins now. The Iraqis estimate it'll take them 12 months of solid work to get them back online again. There isn't enough electricity to work the sewage system. There are whispers of cholera. Now that their troops have pulled out of Kuwait, many Iraqis are confused about why they are still being attacked.
It's not a matter of liberating Kuwait. It's a matter of breaking the Iraqi people.
The Iraqis feel abandoned now. Their cries for help from the Arab states are being ignored. Their diplomatic approaches to the West via the Soviet Union are being rebuffed. Iraq is alone. If the Allied intention is to destroy this country, it's going according to plan. There's a state of siege here in the capital, and tonight's fierce air raid is just going to reinforce that feeling. Jane?
Tom, what do the Iraqis know about what's taken place on the battlefield?
I think they know that something terrible is happening down there. And the reports that they're getting from Western reporters like ourselves that there's now a bottleneck and a killing ground down there in southern Iraq are indeed hitting some of them here very hard indeed.
Tom, how would you characterize the mood in Baghdad?
I would say there's real fear in the air here now, Jane. Fear for the future. What's going to happen to this country? Is it going to be dismembered? I have to add at the same time, there's no feelings of remorse from anybody I've talked to about what has happened in Kuwait. But still, they're at a loss to understand how much they're being punished and indeed why they seem to be humiliated.
Well, thank you, Tom. Tom Aspel in Baghdad. So many Iraqi soldiers have surrendered to Allied forces now that there is no accurate count. General Schwarzkopf said today the number is well over 50,000. NBC's Mike Betcher is a network pool correspondent with the Marines in Kuwait.
Everywhere they advanced, every place they looked, every Iraqi had retreated. Ahead of the advancing 1st Marine Division was an oil field workers' camp which had been converted into an Iraqi command post. But the commanders were gone, and so were their soldiers. When advancing Marine columns have finally caught up to the retreating enemy, many of the Iraqi units have surrendered. A special squad assigned to the 1st Marine Division was sent to intercept yet another Iraqi tank unit, which was seen waving white flags. Its job is to coax them towards American lines.
This unit of men is trying to talk the Iraqis into surrendering. There are a group of men, Iraqis to the right carrying white flags. Over there, a large number of Iraqi tanks. This unit believes they're trying to surrender. They're trying to talk them into it right now.
Through a loudspeaker, Marines ordered the Iraqi troops to turn their tank turrets away, put down their weapons, and surrender. They were promised good treatment. Only 5 Iraqis surrendered initially. They had to pass through their own minefields before they reached Marine positions. The prisoners appeared frightened until they realized that they would not be harmed.
Tell them not to worry, they're going to be all right.
One by one, they were searched for weapons. One prisoner who complained of a lame knee was given medical treatment. Soon, dozens of others walked west towards a line of American tanks and gave up. Just to the east, 58 more surrendered. To get here, they had to dodge mortars, which were fired at them by their own army. A white flag used by the Iraqis was kept as a souvenir by one Marine unit. They thought they would be fighting their enemy, but the enemy had lost its fight. Mike Betcher, NBC News, with the 1st Marine Division in Kuwait.
Where Nightly News continues, Tom Brokaw in Kuwait City talks with Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States.
We're very close to good results.
Mr. Ambassador, in the long time I've known you, I've never known you to struggle for words, so you must be at a very difficult position, and we'll try to deal with that as best we can. Let me ask you about whether Saddam Hussein, who apparently still has words left, has any military power left whatsoever in your judgment?
I believe that the results of the coalition successful and superbly successful military campaign has taken care of the offensive potential of Saddam Hussein at the moment.
Do you think that Saddam Hussein ought to be tried for war crimes? I would think that that would be the judgment of this town, Kuwait City, based on what has happened here in the last 7 months.
Well, I believe you've seen for yourself what happened to the Kuwaitis, and therefore I believe the United Nations resolutions were not there for nothing. And the man has committed a lot of crimes, and somebody has to pay for it, and he's responsible for it.
But won't it be tricky bringing him to justice in some way, because that means getting him in your control physically?
Well, I believe such decisions, Tom, are above my pay grade, but I'm just telling you my views, that somebody should be responsible for it.
Mr. Ambassador, with all due respect, no one is above your pay grade, if I may point that out. But let me ask you another question, and that is, does the alliance at this point have to be a little careful if it continues to kill Iraqi troops, because they no longer can be beholden to the megalomania of their leader?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the megalomania of their leader. We never chose to have this fight. King Fahd and President Bush didn't choose to have this fight. We do not take pleasure of causing injuries and harm to our brothers in Iraq. It is, in fact, it makes me angry to watch the soldiers who were surrendered yesterday, and saddened, angry at Saddam Hussein, who put his people at such risk. So let's hope that he comes to his senses and we can put an end to this tragedy quickly.
Mr. Ambassador, thanks very much for being with us again tonight.
Thank you, Tom, and good luck.
Thank you, sir. Back in a moment, Jane Pauley talking with Mike Jensen about the cost of rebuilding this country, Kuwait.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. America at War continues with Tom Brokaw reporting from Kuwait City and Jane Pauley in Washington.
Good evening once again from Kuwait City, a city that is now celebrating its first full night of liberation. And for Kuwait and for the rest of the world, the light at the end of the tunnel appears to be burning very brightly tonight. President Bush is scheduled to address the American people at 9 tonight, and it does appear that the war is all but over, if it is not over completely. NBC's John Cochran is at the White House now with the latest details on what the president is likely to say. John?
Tom, in an 8 to 10-minute address from the Oval Office tonight, the president will say that essentially the war is over, the Allied coalition has won. The president, however, will not be announcing a ceasefire because Iraq has not met all of those 12 United Nations resolutions. The president will express his concern that the Iraqis could still launch a Scud attack, Scud missile attack, and if that happens, certainly the Allied forces would retaliate. The president will also say that the pressure must continue to get Iraq to meet all of those UN resolutions, including reparations for Kuwait, Tom.
John Cochran, you heard the Saudi ambassador to the United States tonight, Prince Bandar, talk about the possibility of Saddam Hussein being held responsible for war crimes. What does the president have in mind for once the war is over about Saddam Hussein?
Well, the president would like the Kuwaitis to take the lead on this. After all, they're the people who suffered most, who suffered so terribly. So the feeling here at the White House is that for political and just practical reasons, it should be the Kuwaitis who would take the lead. George Bush will gladly see that Saddam Hussein is tried, but it will be an absentia, Tom. There's no planning here at the White House to go in and grab Saddam Hussein and bring him out to Kuwait City where you are.
All right, John Cochran, we'll await the president's speech tonight at 9 Eastern Time. Today, General Norman Schwarzkopf said, of course, that the gate is closed. There is no escape for those Iraqi troops who are just north of here. They have been fighting a pitch battle all day long. They lost at least 3 of their best divisions, probably more than that as the fight went on into the night. Fred Francis reported as well that many of the troops were seen now fleeing toward Iran. Here in Kuwait City tonight, it is a time of celebration, but also reflection for what they have been through in the last 7 months or so. Linda Bester for NBC News went to a neighborhood in this capital city tonight.
This is the first night Kuwaitis have been able to socialize freely in the streets. Now these neighbors are telling horror stories.
24 hours they hit us. Take the boys, take the men, take the youngs, take the girls also, and hit them, and kill them, and put them in front of the door, and call their father and mothers, come out and see your son and see your daughter.
Mohammed Ramadan lost 2 male cousins.
After 1 week, they bring him in front of the door, house, and shot him. His mother didn't know. The other one, they found the gun on his house. They put it in the ceiling, the house. They come and broke everything on the ceiling, and they got the gun. After 1 month, they killed him in front of his house.
Kuwaitis feel betrayed not just by the Iraqis, but also by Palestinian collaborators here.
The Palestinians, they were like a hyena. Tell them everything about the Kuwaiti, about the officers, about our government, even the identity cards. They know everything from them, from the Palestinian people.
These are the stories that have started pouring out of Kuwaiti mouths now that they have a free voice again. Linda Vester for NBC News in Kuwait City.
And NBC's Brad Willis was in the streets of the city all during the night and during the day as well. Brad, there are those continuing stories about atrocities that were committed against the Kuwaiti citizens. What did you hear today from the people that you talked to?
Well, Tom, even while they were celebrating, they did pause and reflect about that. I had several men come up to me and tell me their daughters were raped by Iraqi forces, and then their daughters were shot right before their very eyes. I had several women almost in tears tell me, my son was taken by the Iraqi forces and taken up north. Since they invaded, I haven't seen my son again. Today, I'm celebrating my freedom, but never again will I see my son. Now, these stories are everywhere throughout the city. You can obviously see the atrocities committed against Kuwait City simply by driving through here. As far as where the victims of these atrocities are, we have yet to see them, but the stories are everywhere, and they're coming from the hearts of the people.
And Jane Pauley raised the question as well earlier about the possibility of booby traps left behind by the Iraqi forces. Is that a concern here?
That's a very deep concern. On the outskirts of the city, we have already seen some booby traps. We came through some areas that were heavily booby trapped. We heard a story of one Marine being caught in one 2 days ago and actually having lost his life in a booby trap. There's great concern that here in the city, they left behind many booby traps in some of the buildings that have been bombed and burned out. The forces are already going in certain sectors of the city, door to door, to check for that, to look for possible snipers and explosive traps that might have been left behind here.
Those reports of the Iraqi troops taking hostages as they fled to the north, much to that?
Well, the people say they did. Again, Kuwaiti citizens that I spoke with said some of their family members were taken by the Iraqi forces to the north, and they say also that all of their belongings and possessions were plundered, and they have very little, that from the very beginning, their people and their possessions were taken north.
All right, thanks very much, Brad Willis, who's here with us in Kuwait City. I'll tell you as well, just beyond us in the darkness, there is a cosmopolitan and very sophisticated city. It has no power tonight whatsoever. We'll be back in a moment, and Jane Pauley will be reporting more from New York.
watched the events of recent days and months with as much interest